Continuamos con el desarrollo de esta agenda y ahora le damos paso a nuestra primera invitada internacional. Se trata de Jaana Remes, quien nos hablará sobre ciudades, infraestructura urbana y vivienda, cómo lograr un mayor bienestar. Ella es economista y socia del Mckinsey y además es especialista en urbanización y salud. Tiene un PhD en economía aplicada de la Universidad de Stanford y un MA en economía y filosofía. En esta intervención se discutirán las tendencias del desarrollo urbano global y la importancia de la infraestructura en las ciudades para la construcción de espacios creadores de bienestar para todos. En esta sesión también están con el señor Juan Carlos Daza, director de Servicios Digital para la región andina de Pavco Wavin, para participar de un diálogo que estará moderado por la directora del Heraldo, Erika Fontalvo. Informo que esta conferencia y panel cuenta con el patrocinio de Pavco Wavin, una compañía con más de 55 años de experiencia en soluciones para la conducción de agua potable, alcantarillado, manejo de aguas lluvias, tecnologías para la rehabilitación de tuberías y proyectos de infraestructura sostenible con geosintéticos. Antes de darle la palabra a la doctora Remes, permítame presentar una información de interés de nuestro patrocinador.
En algún momento tuvimos un sueño y decidimos construir una vida respaldándolo. Con agua, con saneamiento, con energía eléctrica, con la infraestructura necesaria para que miles de personas crezcan con la posibilidad de llevar sus sueños a un siguiente nivel. Ofreciendo soluciones inclusivas y sustentables para este mundo cambiante. Porque sabemos que dando lo mejor para nuestra tierra y su gente, beneficiamos la vida de miles de personas que día a día también construyen un mundo mejor. Vivimos y trabajamos por un país maravilloso. Pavco, buscamos mejorar la vida de las personas.
Esta es nuestra primera conferencia internacional, una intervención que se hará en inglés. Si ustedes quieren escucharla en español, simplemente deben activar el botón de traducción simultánea que pueden encontrar en la parte de sus pantallas, en la parte inferior de esta transmisión. Hasta ahora quiero darle paso a la doctora Sandra Forero, quien se encargará de darle introducción a la siguiente conferencia. Doctora Forero.
Maritza, muchas gracias. Lo primero, tengo que hacerlo, quiero presentar excusas a las personas que han tenido problemas para entrar a la plataforma. Está ya funcionando, estamos todos, esto es un gran esfuerzo, pero ya está funcionando la plataforma, presentamos excusas y sigamos adelante. Y bueno, para nosotros, quiero dar un gran agradecimiento a Jaana. Para nosotros es realmente un honor contar con Jaana liderando este tema de ciudad, este tema de cómo lograr más bienestar, cómo tener ciudades productivas que generen bienestar. Lo dije al inicio del Congreso, no podemos hablar de vivienda si no hablamos de ciudades para generarle calidad de vida y bienestar a los ciudadanos. Jaana, muchas gracias. Por supuesto, un saludo a Erika Fontalvo, que nos acompaña en esta conversación, y a Juan Carlos de Pavco. Esto va a ser un panel de lujo. Yo quisiera como plantear, las ciudades son el mejor canal que tenemos para traer bienestar, para traer conocimiento, para traer servicios. Y por supuesto, de su planificación, de esa visión de largo plazo que tengamos, depende que tengamos ciudadanos más contentos, ciudadanos con más ganas de progresar, de disfrutar las ciudades. Nos surgen preguntas como, ¿qué nos cambió el COVID? Por supuesto nos cambió muchas cosas, pero es que tener a Jaana sería desaprovechar uno poder plantear esas inquietudes, estudiosa, experta, mirando el mundo frente a estas reflexiones sobre ciudad. ¿Cómo tenemos que pensar nuestras ciudades y la importancia de la infraestructura urbana? Eso es importante. Hablamos mucho de vivienda, claro, nosotros representamos la construcción de edificaciones, pero tenemos que hablar también de cómo pensar esas ciudades y cómo garantizar esa infraestructura urbana para que haya realmente ciudades de calidad y ciudades integrales. Y los retos de política urbana que se avecinan. Seguramente ya no podemos ver y pensar las ciudades como lo hacíamos antes de COVID-19. Entonces, lo ideal y lo que queremos en este Congreso es poner estos temas sobre la mesa, pero además apropiarnos de estos temas, desde la política pública, desde la política empresarial y desde la gestión gremial. Así que muy bienvenidos, querida Jaana, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Erika y Juan Carlos, adelante.
Good morning, buenos días. Thank you so much for inviting me to join for and well-being. It is a really special moment with the pandemic. It has changed the life of every person under the sun, and cities have really been where that has been felt. Many things are different than they were 2 years ago. And interestingly, the question is how much of the changes we have seen will stay as we move ahead forward from the pandemic. And what I will do in the next 30 minutes or so is to share some of the lessons we have learned over the last year as we have studied the COVID impact on households, on businesses, on cities, as well as what we have learned with conversations with cities around the globe, how they have responded and how they are thinking ahead. So I hope that will leave you at the end with some food for thought on how you might rethink welfare, cities, and life in urban areas as we move forward after the pandemic. So let me start, if I get the next page, please. Let me start with a thought. Arundhati Roy has famously said, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and another. And that really is the essence of what we see happening with the pandemic. Everything paused. Most people had to rethink what they were doing. And as we look ahead, this is a unique opportunity for us to rethink how we want to live, how we want our cities to look like, how we want our houses, our offices, our factories, our infrastructure to be. And few people want to go back with what we had. It is an opportunity to rethink a better world, a different world, and taking a moment to reflect on that, and with an organization like yours, spearhead the changes, because we will shape how we'll come out of the pandemic. It will not be something that's given to us. This is a real opportunity for creating the world we would like to see. And I am very excited to hear that you are taking that opportunity for Colombia. So let me give you a quick idea of how I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes. In the next page, please, I have the 3 sections of the conversation. First, I will describe how we saw changes in the households, businesses, and governments, and how that then requires us to rethink what well-being in an urban environment could mean. Then I'll talk a little bit about how global cities responded. In many cases, they took an opportunity of the crisis to advance their long-term strategies. So rather than just blocking and tackling the crisis, they thought how they can make this moment a moment of change to the direction they wanted. And last, I will finish with a few conversation starters, more than answers, on how urban designers, builders, financiers, and others can shape cities for a healthier, happier, and more resilient future for Colombia. So let's start with the households and consumers. What happened to households? In the next page, please, the one big change was that home really became the center of people's universe. Children in many places couldn't go to school. People had to work from home, or they couldn't work at their workplace. They were displaced. And that meant that time spent on home was much more valuable. That meant that having enough space at home became more important. You needed a place to be able to do work someplace, your children to study. To do that too. You couldn't go and exercise outside. You couldn't go to gyms. Doing that at home became more valuable. So while we have seen with income people valuing more space, the pandemic accelerated that trend. Having more space was very valuable at that time, which we expect is going to change somewhat because many families invested on making their home more livable, invested in working spaces, gyms, etc. And it is likely that after you have created that space, you will value that more in the future. And we also expect that more work will continue to be done at home. More digital entertainment is going to happen at home. And that means we probably will see demand for larger homes accelerate more than we would have seen without the pandemic. In the next page then is the second big transition, and that was the digitization. Clearly, when you were working from home, your children were going to school digitally, you could go to movies or you could go to other events. You started streaming more entertainment to your house. High-speed internet became even more important. Those people who have access to it, I think, were able to benefit and suffer much less from the restrictions of the pandemic. However, that also highlighted the digital divide of those who didn't. That clearly, from many cities, regions, countries, and households, really increased the importance of digitization. Again, one of those things, and high-speed internet, again, one of those things that we saw accelerate before, but the pandemic really accelerated that. And it will likely change. People who bought larger TVs, entertainment sets, gaming studios are very likely to continue to use some of those tools in the future. And also, there was a generation of particularly older households in many parts of the world who didn't really need to use digital tools. And the pandemic really forced them to try, and many of them liked it. So we probably saw a real increase in the demand for digitization, particularly for those cohorts. The third big impact for households, if I can get the next page, please, was the value of housing. We have seen urbanization, the concentration of people, density being highly valued because of the fact that we are all social beings. But when the pandemic hit and social distancing or spatial distancing became important, having access to the outdoors, being able to be in places that were safe at the safe distance became increasingly important. And interestingly, because of the fact that people spent less time traveling for work, commuting, many people who were fortunate enough to not suffer the income hit of the household of the pandemic, they slept longer, they exercised more, they had a higher quality time with their families outdoors, and particularly some of the younger cohorts who might have been more focused on their career now have a slightly different outlook and value more the space and outdoors and the quality of time with their families, for example, or with their friends. And that is likely, we expect, another trend that will change. The prioritization of the kinds of parts of well-being that may not have been as high priority when you had access to exciting urban dense activities. So we expect these three things to obviously not stay as strong as during the pandemic, but really change, slightly shift and accelerate the trends for households, and something to consider as we think of cities as places for well-being. At the same time, we also saw companies dramatically change. If I could get the next page, obviously, the first thing that happens to businesses was that they had to improve. Can I get the next page, please? That companies had to be able to keep their workers and their customers healthy. And that really was a big change. You need to quickly change your business processes, etc. Sorry, can I get the next page, please? They had to very quickly change the way they were doing things, and that led many companies to innovate, automate, bring in new tools, find a way to avoid the fact that you have many of your workers get ill and actually you have to close your operations. That happened everywhere, from food processing to ports, leading to actually real shortages on the real world and real sense of urgency for companies. In the next page, please, we have the other impact on companies, which was digitization. Obviously, office workers or white collar workers, you had to get your Zoom or whatever your your preferred medium of connectivity increased because of the fact that people were hesitant to go to stores. So you had digitization of purchases and sales increased. And it even changed things like TV studios. Movie theaters were ones that were perceived to be risky and often closed, which meant that movie studios were strongly nudged to release their new movies on digital format, which is likely going to stay because so many people liked it. And we will have a harder time to see all the movie theaters come back. So that clearly is another trend that we expect to have not only accelerated, but really stick as we look forward. And last, the point that is probably most important for cities. If you can move, if I can get the next page, please. One thing that happened when people looked for more space, they were working from home, is that more of activity, more spending, more commercial, more entertainment moved to suburbs. Can I get the next page, please? And that means that city centers where office workers were a big part of the office, of the business, they tended to be empty, and a lot more demand for whether it was takeout food in the suburbs, whether it was haircuts, whether it was anything else that was happening closer to the households rather than closer to the businesses, really shifted the preferences. And this happened particularly in some of the big urban centers, like in the US, San Francisco and New York. I don't know exactly where that happened in Colombia, but that we are having a renaissance or rise of suburban services, more local, more dispersed model than the more concentrated at the city centers. And again, given the consumer demand to stay at home, given the worker demand to not go back to work, to stay, we expect there's going to be 20% less business travel, 20% more working from home. So some of that real spatial shift is going to stay. So that's businesses, clear changes for them that is going to accelerate automation because of the fact that workers need to be safe, accelerate digitization, as well as shift some of the urban demand for space and services. So what happened in cities? If I can get the next page, please. It was the time when the local governments really had two very different priorities and both equally urgent. There was the health challenge of protecting lives and the economic challenge of protecting livelihoods, and they were not competing. You had to get both. And what we saw happen in a lot of cities was that it changed the way cities operated. Decision-making became much, much faster. The urgency created communication channels across different previously siloed organizations. You really saw different groups of city organizations come together and address those challenges. You saw innovation and change at speed that we haven't really seen. So while it was and has been and continues to be a real challenge for city governments, it also has been a moment of innovation and change. And much of that we hear from cities, they want to stay. So all of this between households, companies, and city governments, there is a moment of change, and the big question is, what of this will stick? Before I go and talk a little bit more about those changes we have seen elsewhere, one reminder, this was the most unequal crisis we have seen. If I can get the next page, please. Those households and workers who were able to work from home, they maintained their income, but they weren't able to spend on their travel or restaurant or entertainment. They basically increased their savings, invested on their homes. Their household savings dramatically increased for that segment everywhere around the world. On the other hand, if I can get the next page, please, those who were directly impacted by the economic shock of the health crisis were in a very harsh situation. And this is particularly hard for countries like Colombia, where you have a number of self-employed who don't have the safety nets necessarily, whose income immediately stops when their business ends. And that really widened the inequality, and the poverty rates and the households facing challenges dramatically increased. And those were also oftentimes the people who were living in conditions where the health risks were higher. So addressing some of the inequality issues. And as we heard from the vice president right now, it also was uneven by gender lines, because women were often more harshly impacted because they work in services that were closed, and because they suddenly faced the need for caring for their children who no longer had access for education. So this really is also really brought to the forefront the inequality challenge. So if I can get the next page, we can continue and start talking about how did cities respond to this. I will not focus on how they address the pandemic. That is something that I think we hope is going to be in the rearview mirror. Let's think about now, when with all of this moment of change, how did cities respond? What did they want the pandemic legacy to be? And interestingly, we saw most cities focus on advancing their longer-term strategies. If I give you a few examples from around the world, if I can get the next page, please. Perhaps the most, Paris is 15-minute city, which many of you may have heard. It was one that clearly was almost tailor-made for the pandemic's demands. The idea is that every person should be able to live, work, shop, get entertainment, get public services within 15-minute radius of where they live. This is something most cities that have a business center and suburb surroundings, it's very, very different in those environments. However, there are cities like Tokyo that has been able to grow into by far the largest city in the world, exactly by making it more balanced in terms of its activities within the city. And that was Paris's aspiration. And they clearly used a lot of the pandemic stimulus efforts to focus on creating a space like that. Another example is Malmö, traditionally a green spaces city, but they doubled down on that to make sure that they actually had the opportunities to create access to outdoors for many, many other people as well that didn't have them before. Can I get the next page, please? Another priority for many cities was green change and green urban spaces. One of the very common ones, and I'll have example on the left from Milan, which is basically Milan that decided to close down bikeable. This happened in many cities around the world, because of the fact that suddenly we didn't have the commute traffic. We were able to create more comfortable spaces for walkers, for bicycle drivers, and perhaps find ways for investing on alternative routes for people to get to the city. Seoul, on the other hand, with Korea's continued focus on technology, started with driverless or robot delivery. The robot that you can see on the right-hand side picture is one which actually started working on a large apartment complex where you can order from with the app of the company, you can order from any of the restaurants in the platform and have that delivered close to your home. So all of these were opportunities that the pandemic really helped create opportunity for the change and made it more attractive to users. Another example on the next page, please, is the fact that we really saw some of the more vulnerable populations be harshly impacted. Homeless, clearly at risk for health, and it was an opportunity for cities, Rotterdam being one of the examples of really thinking what to do with the homeless or houseless population. Mexico City, on the other hand, focused on investing a lot of funding on urban corridors for social housing, putting some of that investment there, at the same time creating jobs as well as housing. And if I can get the next page, please, then there are other cities that really focused on some of the social, some of the economic development priorities they had. One of the biggest areas of challenge, and I am sure you know of that in Colombia too, is the fact that city centers suffered from the small and medium-sized businesses in city centers were very hardly hit when you didn't have the commuters, the workers, and you didn't have the visitors. And Madrid, for example, put a lot of the effort of supporting the small and medium-sized enterprises by giving them tax breaks and releasing some of the restrictions on employment laws in order to really foster and support them. In Singapore, on the other hand, one of the longer-term priorities for the country that today imports 90% of their food is to increase their food production from domestic sources to 30% in the next 10 years. And they really focused on investing on some of the urban farms, some different innovations on how to do that in their dense environment. So all of these are more of food for thought on what are the kinds of things that other cities are doing to take advantage of the COVID moment of pause for reflecting of how they want their cities to evolve, and given the real economic need to change, and given the pause in the households and businesses, it is a moment when you can get things done easier than you would have otherwise. And I think if I can get the next page, please. The one thing at this moment is that where we come out will depend on the decisions that governments, cities, companies do, much more than what ultimately even consumers want. I think we want to be informed about that, but this is a moment when the actions of the public sector, the private sector, really will matter for how we come out of the pandemic and what kind of cities, what kind of well-being environment we create. So if I can get the next page, please. So what I would like to do is to finish with some food for thought, perhaps for us to have on the conversation of the pandemic, with the panel that follows, as well as potentially some of the conversations you have in the next 3 days during the Congress, is what are the kinds of opportunities that the pandemic creates for creating healthier and happier and more resilient future for Colombian cities. So if I can get the first part of the next page, please. So here are the areas on where we see the changes. In a way, our houses where we live, they used to go from just being a home to being a hub for many activities, for home, for work, for school, for cafe, for entertainment. And thinking about that as what changes does that mean for urban design? We saw, for example, that some of the past pandemics changed and led us to do more functional or modernist design that was cleaner, that had less space for, if you want, for bacteria to live. How will we rethink our cities, our homes, our houses, when we know there is going to be probably more demand for multi-use than we had before? On work side, we really, in most cities, used to have the financial and business hubs in specific places. Now we are likely to see more dispersed work. That will create different transit requirements. That will create different digital speed requirements, different infrastructure. It may require different demand for office space. For example, I think areas like San Francisco and New York, they expect the financial district potentially the really high demand for their space may decline. I think that will vary from city to city, but we are likely to see some kind of shifts in the real estate weights as we look forward. Shopping, very clearly that we moved from we really accelerated digitization. It's not that online shopping was new, but this clearly accelerated it and made it very likely more sticky, because a lot of people who might not have used the digital online or digital tools for their shopping actually were nudged to try, and they liked what they saw. Of course, how much of that will stick will depend how ready the providers were to offer that. But thinking about what does it mean for our urban design and our cities if indeed we are going to see the commercial shopping flows differ and we'll have more delivery vans and delivery motos on the road and fewer people going to shopping malls, perhaps less demand for parking. Socialization. I touched on this one earlier. The concerns for some of the folks of the health risk of really close contact has made it harder to design really large social events. And I think while this will vary by place and by cohort and by personality, we are probably going to continue to see, unless we see the pandemic go over much more completely than I think the current expectations are, there will continue to be demand for social events with safe distancing. And I think that is something we need to watch. I think there's quite a bit of uncertainty about the social side of the how that will evolve over time. Transportation. So I think that is something to watch for because of the fact that it will depend on how the pandemic evolves. Then it's transportation. And in this case, this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, for most folks because of the fact that we were trying to go to multimodal, more public transit, less climate harming transportation. Yet public transit has been probably the most suffered, most challenged institution in the pandemic because of the fact that the usership and the payments and the income declined dramatically. People wanted to move to cars and bikes. I think here, I'm not saying that we will stay in cars and bikes, but I think it is a real challenge. How are we going to make sure that public transit will feel safe? And how are we going to balance that, especially if there are some of the new modes like bikes that are increasing? And last, city services. I think we have traditionally thought of city services more as centralized, but as we see the more dispersed living and working, the more dispersed services you have, the better. The better it will be for many of the folks who would prefer to stay within near to their homes. And here, particularly the health services, it was very clear that cities that were able to provide deliver public health interventions that helped keep their cities safer. So clearly, these are the areas where we expect to see some changes. It is going to vary by city. It's going to vary depending on what the governments decide to prioritize and what the companies, especially the ones who are shaping the cities with construction, with design, with architecture, with services, you will be the ones who will help shape how these end up coming out of the pandemic. And I think it really is an exciting moment, despite all the challenges, to think of this as an opportunity of shaping our cities. So with that, I would like to move to the next page and thank you all again for inviting me to join the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Remes, for being with us. Muchísimas gracias a la doctora Remes. Ahora quiero darle la bienvenida a Juan Carlos Daza de Pavco Wavin, quien estará en un diálogo moderado por la periodista y directora del diario El Heraldo, Erika Fontalvo. Erika, le cedo la palabra. Adelante. Buen día.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenos días para todos. Muchas gracias por la invitación, por permitirnos estar aquí. Los saludamos desde la ciudad de Barranquilla y reconocemos sin lugar a dudas la importancia de la vivienda, porque Barranquilla, el departamento del Atlántico, es una región líder en estos temas con un crecimiento notable en comercialización de vivienda nueva. En este año, solo en el mes de julio, hemos crecido alrededor del 138% y a lo largo de todo este año cerca del 88%. Así que la vivienda como fuente generadora de bienestar, pero además como motor de reactivación, es sin lugar a dudas un tema central en Barranquilla y en el departamento del Atlántico. Hemos escuchado con atención esa interesante, muy interesante exposición que nos ha hecho la señora Jaana Remes de Mckinsey Global Institute, socia, líder global en infraestructura y desarrollo urbano, que sin lugar a dudas Juan Carlos Daza, director de servicios digital para la región andina de Pavco Wavin, es uno de los temas más importantes de este Congreso Colombiano de la Construcción, en el que se habla de bienestar. Antes de comenzar este conversatorio, quiero saludar también a Sandra Forero, la presidenta de Camacol, por esta invitación, por su liderazgo precisamente al convertirse claramente la construcción en uno de los ejes de reactivación, de recuperación económica y también social en nuestro país, con unos resultados muy importantes, con unos resultados muy positivos. Arranquemos con Juan Carlos para luego contrastar un poco con Ana. Al fin y al cabo, el desafío que ella plantea a través de su exposición, Juan Carlos, nos lleva a pensar cómo precisamente las ciudades pueden promover ese bienestar, cómo deben repensar en este momento los diseñadores, los constructores, las organizaciones financieras en general también, por supuesto, todo el sector público y en general el sector privado, ese rediseño de unas ciudades post-pandemia, donde se prioricen temas importantes como es la protección de la vida, claramente, pero también, por supuesto, esos espacios para que la gente pueda tener una vida familiar, una vida laboral, encuentre seguridad, no solo en sus espacios privados, sino también en el espacio público. Buenos días, Juan Carlos.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias, Erika. Primero, pues para mí es muy halagador compartir este panel con Jaana. Sus investigaciones, sus trabajos nos ofrecen un norte y nuevas ópticas acerca de cómo podemos aportar bienestar de las ciudades desde la infraestructura y la vivienda. Gracias, Camacol, por la invitación. Bueno, creo que la pandemia generada por el COVID nos demostró nuestra rápida adaptación como seres humanos y aún más nuestra capacidad de resiliencia ante riesgos y emergencias. Yo creo que el mayor cambio se presentará en la gestión de riesgos ante futuras pandemias y la resiliencia al cambio climático. Las estrategias urbanas en las fases de respuesta, mitigación y sobre todo preparación generan un nuevo replanteo con los nuevos patrones que los centros urbanos tienen ahora con los efectos de la pandemia. El uso de nuevas tecnologías en las fases de respuesta y mitigación van a ser cruciales. Por ejemplo, una mayor conexión entre los operadores de servicios con sus activos nos permitirá predecir con mayor anterioridad los efectos de las emergencias y nos transportarán en una gestión más proactiva que reactiva. Puedo dar un ejemplo. Hoy tenemos, digamos que, storm sensors que gestionan de una forma proactiva los problemas de la cantidad y el apoyo en inundaciones a las comunidades. Podemos proporcionar diagnósticos en tormentas en alcantarillas y sistemas costeros en tiempo real, lo que permite tomar medidas de manera preventiva, planear las soluciones con mejor información y sobre todo utilizar los recursos de una manera más eficiente.
Aquí claramente ese tema de la gestión de riesgo a veces queda corto de acuerdo con ese avance imparable que se está registrando en otra emergencia ya no sanitaria, sino la emergencia climática que se refería a Jaana también en su presentación, y tú, Juan, lo acabas de precisar, que muchas veces no llega a pesar de la previsión que se pueda tener por el avance descomunal precisamente y acelerado de todo este impacto. En ese sentido, ¿cómo lograr una articulación entre el sector privado y lo público? Porque al fin y al cabo los que toman decisiones en estos temas son precisamente las autoridades desde el sector público, que a veces llegan un poco tarde a cuando se requiere agilidad, celeridad para tomar este tipo de decisiones y garantizar el bienestar dentro de las ciudades para las personas cuando enfrentamos emergencias, bien sea climáticas, y esta emergencia sanitaria que nos ha cambiado la forma de ver el mundo en general.
A ver, yo creo que todo arranca en las fases de preparación, ¿sí? Nos demostró que tenemos que seguir transformando y mejorando nuestra resiliencia urbana en las viviendas y en los espacios públicos. Jaana lo decía muy bien, nosotros cambiamos nuestra forma de ver y las pandemias son la perfecta transición entre el pasado y el futuro. Creo que el reto es de poder abrir nuevos espacios de colaboración entre la academia, entre el sector privado, entre el sector público, pero sobre todo el involucramiento de los ciudadanos en el uso de esas nuevas herramientas para crear una mejor sociedad y unas mejores ciudades. Entonces, antes hablábamos de solo el triángulo de oro de la academia, el sector privado, el sector público. Hoy en día el individuo, el ciudadano es el centro y básicamente vamos a tener muchos espacios de conectividad con ellos.
¿Cómo sería esa hoja de ruta, Juan, para dar pasos significativos en ese sentido, para lograr que efectivamente desde el sector público y el sector privado, liderando, articulándose, se puedan dar beneficios reales y la gente los necesita de manera cada vez más inmediata? tanto en sus espacios privados como en la construcción y sobre todo en la planificación urbana de los espacios públicos, teniendo en cuenta que la gente ahora demanda precisamente más posibilidades para acceder a esos espacios?
Básicamente, nosotros creemos en dos ejes. Uno, los gremios son parte fundamental. Ese es el eje que conecta estos diferentes stakeholders que interactúan y que tienen que estar siempre en una cooperación y comunicación. Y lo otro es el uso de tecnología. Creo que el salto a usar tecnología, el salto a poder transformar toda la información que hoy tenemos en las ciudades en real conocimiento para el uso de los operarios de las ciudades, son las hojas de ruta que debemos profundizar y abrir los canales de diálogo y esto es un evento donde creo que son los adecuados para poder empezar a tener esas iniciativas y esa hoja de ruta, como tú dices, Erika, que debemos todos ser partícipes. No hay el Estado solo, no hay empresa sola, no hay sociedad sola. Creo que hoy en día nos demostramos que estamos más conectados que siempre, somos más iguales que siempre y necesitamos transformar eso en un beneficio y creo que el reto es aplicar también tecnología. La tecnología está, ahora nosotros tenemos que tener el reto de traerla al país, aplicarla y volverla alcanzable para nosotros, para nuestros ciudadanos y para los colombianos.
Precisamente, Juan, y ya para ir redondeando contigo esta primera intervención y darle la palabra a Jaana para que también nos dé sus opiniones frente a este tema en Colombia, un poco aterrizando lo que ella nos ha planteado a nivel global, que son como los grandes retos y desafíos y lo que se está haciendo de acuerdo con experiencias internacionales. ¿Cómo ves nuestra propia evolución? Tú que estás metido de lleno en esta actividad y que a diario estás dando respuesta a esas necesidades que surgen desde el mercado y a partir ahora de la pandemia. ¿Cómo está esa demanda por parte del ciudadano de a pie que quiere cambios significativos a partir de esta nueva vida con el teletrabajo, con una vida familiar que sea verdaderamente incluyente, que le ofrezca bienestar, pero que también le permite realizar otras actividades?
Erika, nosotros vemos una tendencia muy importante en temas del agua como un factor eje de competitividad de las ciudades, ¿sí? Claramente, el agua juega un papel fundamental en nuestro futuro, ¿sí? Las ciudades sin fuentes seguras y estables de agua van a tener desafíos mucho más grandes para mantener su potencial y dar ese beneficio, ese bienestar a sus ciudadanos. Vamos a ver ciudades que van a trabajar muy fuerte en reducir sus pérdidas de agua en los sistemas. Hoy en día en América Latina tenemos un promedio de pérdida de agua del 47% en los sistemas de agua potable y por medio de la tecnología vamos a llegar a indicadores impensables. Sí, hoy tenemos, digamos, tecnologías dentro del grupo y estamos haciendo un esfuerzo muy grande en traerlas ya a Colombia, donde podemos inclusive detectar las fugas antes que se presenten. Y con esta tecnología, usando básicamente la información disponible, apoyándonos de Machine Learning e inteligencia artificial, podemos crear algoritmos súper poderosos que pueden detectar cualquier cambio en los eventos y en el comportamiento de las mismas ciudades. Entonces, desde el punto de vista del sector y de Wavin, vamos a tener ese direccionamiento y que impacta a las personas. O sea, tener agua potable es el eje de competitividad de cualquier ciudad y va a impactar a nosotros como ciudadanos y como que vivimos en ciudades.
Claro, y es un tema muy vinculado precisamente con todo lo del impacto del cambio climático, que insistimos va también siendo un factor más importante incluso que la misma pandemia, que la misma emergencia sanitaria, porque evidentemente ya el mundo va transitando hacia una nueva etapa, pero seguimos afrontando y de manera permanente y cada vez lo vamos a hacer más todo lo relacionado con la emergencia climática. Quisiera preguntarle a Jaana también un poco que nos ayude a establecer para nuestro país, de acuerdo con el conocimiento que ella tiene acerca de nuestra propia realidad, cuáles serían esos pasos que hay que dar para acercarnos a ese escenario, a esas ciudades, a construir, a planificar inicialmente, a diseñar y a gestionar ciudades que sean verdaderamente atractivas, espacios que generen calidad de vida y progreso socioeconómico para los ciudadanos, dentro de nuestro contexto y dentro de nuestras limitaciones, Jaana, de Colombia, que somos un país que da pasos significativos, pero que claramente todavía tenemos unos retos pendientes enormes.
Thank you for the question, Erika. When we look at cities that are really good at addressing some of the challenges that they face, and I think we have many of them, I think with the pandemic right now, with the climate change, as we have talked about, and I think there were many of the challenges that were just long-term challenges of housing, of transportation and congestion. The cities that are able to kind of understand their own problems, prioritize them so they know what to work on first, and then do something about it, are cities where you have the different sectors, the government, the private sector, the social sector, the universities, working together and pulling into the same direction. And frankly, looking at globally, I have often been impressed by how cities in Colombia have done that. You have a lot of communication across the different cities. I think you have demonstrated a number of examples of being able to address challenges. I think there are examples of multiple examples that I often talk about of what you have done. So I think you have a great starting point. The fact that you have organizations like yours, you have conversations like these, where you include sectors from different parts, is actually exactly what is needed. So in that sense, I think it is, you see that everywhere. And I come from Finland, for example, and it's interesting to see that there are some, especially smaller cities, where these connections are very tight, and it's very clear that the city and the region work together to pull in the same direction, and there good things happen. And I think that is the critical part. On the other hand, you see many regions, and frankly, I happen to live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which I think everyone would recognize has the challenge that we do not see that alignment oftentimes. And I think it has meant that San Francisco has prospered despite the challenges that we face, but it also has led to very big problems that we are unable to address, like housing and homelessness, high cost of living, etc., congestion. And I think for that, so I wish I had an answer, of a cookbook answer of this is what you need to do. Instead, I would say that you have all the ingredients of making the most of this moment, and I look forward to watching what you will accomplish.
Esa unidad, ¿no? Esa articulación de la que habla Jaana, que es tan absolutamente importante, que es definitiva, que también coincide Juan, y que precisamente con la presencia de la vicepresidenta y canciller Marta Lucía Ramírez, la veíamos, ese compromiso que existe por parte de lo público y también de las autoridades territoriales para construir esa mejor calidad de vida. Sin embargo, y quiero volver con Juan aquí y luego también trasladar esa pregunta a Jaana, todo eso tiene un costo importante porque las ciudades ya están establecidas y generar esos procesos evidentemente requiere muchos recursos, y ahora tenemos claro que estamos en un proceso de recuperación socioeconómica muy exigente, muy difícil, pero todo tiene que darse de manera, insisto, acelerada, porque es lo que demanda la gente, ¿no? Que quiere ya insertarse en esa nueva realidad de forma definitiva y dejar atrás la pesadilla, Jaana, Juan, de lo que ha sido todo este tema de la COVID-19. Entonces, ¿cómo lograrlo? ¿Cómo priorizar, Juan?
Quiero retomar algo que Jaana dijo muy bien. Las ciudades tienen el reto de definir cuáles son sus problemas y priorizarlos, y retomar que hoy en día existe tecnología que les puede ayudar a hacer eso de una manera más eficiente. Voy a poner un ejemplo muy claro. Hoy en día estamos rehabilitando tuberías de hace más de 50, 80 años de uso, sin generar traumatismos en las sociedades, porque todo se hace debajo de la superficie en tiempos récords. Y eso genera ahorros. ¿Por qué? Porque genera menos impacto en el comercio. Las personas pueden movilizarse más rápido. Pero más aún, pienso que las tecnologías, y lo han demostrado muchos sectores, traen una optimización de procesos muy importante, y eso es lo que va a permitir los ahorros a futuro. Posiblemente las inversiones iniciales nos van a costar en reducir ese gap, en estar listos a emplearlas con las tecnologías disponibles, pero solo invirtiendo en ese sentido podemos tener resultados a futuro. Entonces, los retos van a estar ahí. Eh, Poco para complementar la pregunta, hay un estudio que me encanta de la Academia Nacional de Ingeniería de Estados Unidos, donde dice que el rol más importante de la ingeniería o los ingenieros en el siglo XXI es modernizar las estructuras fundamentales que soportan una civilización. Y creo que ahí está el eje. Si todos nos subimos al barco en poner nuestro grano de arena, o muchas otras opciones de poder reducir esos costos de inversión, los resultados futuros van a ser increíbles.
¿Cómo priorizar, Jaana, para poder rentabilizar lo que la comunidad, la ciudadanía está reclamando en medio de la poquedad, ¿no? De la escasez de recursos?
I so wish I would have the answer to that question. But I think two big things I think to reflect on. I think the pandemic has somewhat changed people's priorities in terms of just the quality of life versus just pure focus on let's say, I think thinking a little bit of the benefits of the green spaces, the clean water, as Juan was saying, I think that is an important part for most of the decisions that either the public or the private sector is going to do. And the second one, and I really liked, Juan, your suggestion of the kind of the tools and innovation. I think this pandemic has seen an acceleration in innovation. We saw it most notably in the pharmaceutical industry with the rapid entry of the vaccines. That is a miracle that I think we all should be grateful for. We could be in a much worse situation today. It may seem gloomy, but it would be so much worse without that innovation. I think we saw similarly on the digitization of small and medium-sized businesses. We saw the same thing in transportation delivery infrastructures that needed to adjust. If we can keep that spirit of innovation and bring it to cities, I'm thinking about an example of construction, for example, where perhaps the introduction of new mobile solutions, the new low-cost delivery of housing that may not meet the standards of every city today, how we can make sure that we actually innovate in a way that delivers what people want right now. And I think I'm seeing that in California, for example, some of the new solutions for homelessness that are different from what we might traditionally have seen. And I think the spirit of innovation, together with the fact that we reconsider our priorities, this actually can mean that we will speed up getting to the kind of future we would all like to see for ourselves, but especially for our children and grandchildren.
Bueno, vamos a ir redondeando y finalmente quisiera tanto a Juan como a Jaana agradeciéndoles esta charla tan absolutamente interesante, porque estos son los temas que realmente quisiéramos poder debatir, entender, porque definitivamente hay que repensar el futuro. El futuro no es mañana, el futuro es hoy, y esta pandemia y quienes diseñan la política pública en torno a pensando cómo generar mejores condiciones de vida, mejor calidad de vida para los colombianos, que muchos de ellos han desmejorado notablemente esas condiciones debido a la pandemia. Arranco con Juan para terminar con el mensaje final de Jaana.
Muchas gracias, Erika. Creo que hoy tenemos una oportunidad increíble e irrepetible de poner al uso de la ciudad en otros sectores. Y la invitación a todos estos estudiantes que hoy nos oyen es que sigan soñando, sigan inventando, sigan creando, porque necesitamos más que nunca y hoy en día las herramientas de innovar y traer nuevas cosas están disponibles más fácil que nunca. Solo así podemos hacer unas ciudades más vivibles y mejores lugares para vivir. Ese es el mensaje de cierre. Gracias, Jaana, por esa increíble presentación y a Erika por moderar este debate.
Jaana, ciudades más resilientes, más innovadoras, mejores ciudades para las personas que vivimos en ella, para que definitivamente quisiéramos estar, nos quedáramos en nuestras ciudades absolutamente felices. Ojalá ciudades con movilidad sostenible, que ese es uno de nuestros grandes retos aquí en Colombia. Jaana.
I think you have all the ingredients for making the future that you want. And I will just say, be brave, continue to do what you do, and continue to work together. And that is exactly what I will be watching for. And I suspect there will be more innovations for the world that come out of Colombia. So I wish you the very best luck, and I will be watching and hopefully learning from what you do.
Juan, Jaana, Adriana, ha sido un gusto haber estado con ustedes. Un saludo muy especial desde la ciudad de Barranquilla, una ciudad que apuesta por la todo lo que aquí se está construyendo, la primera biodiversidad de Colombia con un gran esfuerzo. Un abrazo a todos y que avance con este maravilloso nivel, este congreso en el que el solo título es atractivo. ¿Cómo generamos bienestar? ¿Cómo generamos nuevas ciudades en este momento tan coyuntural en la historia de la humanidad? Después, siendo con ella, aún seguimos en esta lucha, cuidándonos todos, pero claramente que sea un motivo de esperanza, que sea un motivo de ilusión y de optimismo, saber que eso nos está dejando avances significativos y precisamente el tema de la construcción es uno de ellos. Muchísimas gracias y a todos muy buenos días. Un abrazo.
Con 23 años de experiencia, desarrollamos proyectos urbanos y revitalizamos territorios para una mejor ciudad. Como banco inmobiliario, habilitamos suelo para garantizar vivienda de interés social y prioritario. Mejoramos el espacio público y ofertamos áreas vitales de uso mixto donde la gente pueda vivir y trabajar. Formulamos instrumentos de planeamiento para el desarrollo de proyectos sostenibles y de calidad. Somos la empresa de renovación y desarrollo urbano de Bogotá. Sabemos lo que hacemos. Somos el mejor aliado para proyectos de ciudad. Con una renovación incluyente, ganamos todos.
Al pintar mi casa, el futuro pinta bien.
Pintuco, pintando viviendas. El futuro pinta bien.